Hi. Having just done a long video about the French way of war, I thought it would be good to follow up with another look at Ferdinand Foch, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, and to talk about him a little bit more. Now, I know what you're thinking. Shirkin, didn't you already make a video about Foch? I did. But this, you see, is a work in progress, meaning I'm reading more, I'm learning more, I'm rethinking a lot of the stances that I already had. And perhaps more to the point, I wrote a book about French military strategy, and I've been shopping this around to various publishers. And one of the editors at one of these publishing houses said to me, "Hey, I think that you should revise your chapter on Foch in this way and that way," which has caused me to pick up Foch again and reread Foch and read more about Foch in order to sort of revise my own thinking about Foch. So this video, to a large extent, is a trial run at my new take on Foch. By the way, my name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana. It's a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be in my mind. This video it hits two birds with one stone because it's both about military strategy and it's about what happens to be on my mind because I'm revising that chapter on Foch for this publisher. If you like this video, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe if you have not done so already. It helps the channel and it subsidizes my book purchases and perhaps more importantly, my beer consumption, which is more important than anything. The first thing that needs to be gotten out of the way is the question of why you should care about Foch. Now, my answer is as follows. First of all, he was the Supreme Allied Commander during World War I. Now, that war was much too big and much too long for anybody credibly to say that any one person deserves credit for the Allied victory. But if you had to pick one person, I think Foch is the obvious candidate. Second, Foch is the father of modern military strategy. So if that's a modern French military strategy. So if that's at all a topic of interest to you, then you've got to begin with Foch, which is why my book about modern French military strategy begins with a chapter on Foch. The next question, though, is whether or not Foch is relevant today, given that he published his most important work, which is this, on the principles of war, in 1903. My answer is yes, it is relevant. Not just because of his influence in contemporary military strategy, but also because his intellectual project, of which the principles of war is really just the largest fruit, remains very valuable and pertinent today. What he hoped to teach his students. And for years, he was a professor, and then at some point, he was the director of one of the French Army's highest level military schools. It is still valuable. And if you could transport him to today's Army War College to give lectures, I think those lectures would be worth everybody's while. The students would get a lot out of this. I think about this now more than ever because my eldest son actually happens to be a cadet at West Point. And I think about, like, what do I want my son to learn? Like, what do I want them to be teaching my son? And would it be worthwhile for them to teach him Foch? I don't think they are, but would it be worth their while? I think so, because of what Foch is trying to do. And he's trying to address people like my son, these young budding officers, would-be officers, how to think. So I think it would be really worthwhile. Will I ever get a chance to lecture on Foch at West Point? I don't know. Probably not. But I am happy to report that, according to my son, my YouTube videos are popular amongst West Point cadets. So yay me. So that's great. Okay, so here's the deal with Foch. Before cracking open the principles of war, you need to understand that there are really three Foches, or three sides to Foch, or three faces to Foch. There's Foch the professor, Foch the prescriber, and then Foch the commander. So by prescriber, I mean somebody who wrote things that he thought officers should do. Now, the tendency among readers of Foch's Principles of War is to really focus on Foch the prescriber. I think that they miss the point, and also people who do that are the ones who are most likely to write Foch off as an irrelevant anachronism and say something like, well, this might have been useful in 1903, but it hardly applies today. The place to begin with is Foch the professor, which he was for much of his military career. So what was Foch's intellectual project? Foch lays this out very nicely in the opening pages of the Principles, where he discusses the question of whether war was something that could even be taught. He saw two extremes. One was to argue that it couldn't be taught other than on the job, which is a difficult position, of course, for him to take because he's a professor in a war college. So, he's not about to say this is all pointless, go outside. But then the other extreme was to believe that war was teachable, but then to get carried away and to try to deduce scientific principles, or perhaps to think exclusively in terms of quantifiable material things. Victory could be imagined as a formula in which most of the important variables were quantitative things, were things like the number of troops on each side, the number of guns, the quality of guns, the range of the guns, etc. Foch thought that first, war could not be reduced to a science with rules that if one were to follow, one would be guaranteed to succeed. He just thought that that's just not how it works. Two, he thought that an overly positivist approach that would give far too little weight to the intangible qualities such as will, morale, and spirit. Foch, you see, was a practicing Catholic, and at the time, intellectually, the French were kind of divided into two camps. I'm oversimplifying, but go with me. You've got like this sort of conservative Catholic France, and then this positivist, anti-clerical France. Now, unfortunately, this also means that Foch was anti-Dreyfus-Starr, but I'm happy to say, based on the biographies about him, that he was hardly a strident anti-Semite. I think it's more fair to say that his anti-Semitism was something of, what one would be normal of a man in his world and his class and his background. It's sort of like this gentlemanly thing where maybe he wouldn't invite Jewish officers over to his home for dinner, but I don't think he would have objected to working with Jewish officers or to serving under them or having them serve under him. There's no trace of anything like that. Foch was a Republican, albeit a conservative one, and I really strongly doubt he would have warmed to Vichy. So how then does one teach war? Foch believed that the answer lay in a careful study of military history, but knew of looking to deduce scientific principles. What he wanted to do was to teach his students how to think, how to size up a situation, and how to make a decision about what to do. This is important. Foch wanted to teach how to think, not what to think. His slogan was, in French, it's "De quoi s'agit-il?", which translates roughly as, "What is it about?" Meaning like, what's going on? What's the crux of the issue? How do we think about this thing? Now, in this light, the principles of war, which I discussed in detail, the actual principles in my previous video, and I put a link to the description, and you can see it like somewhere above me, it's less about rules of strategy that he wanted commanders to follow, but rather things that he wanted them to have in mind as they analyze whatever situation they happen to be in. As to what to do, I think Foch would tell us that it was entirely up to each commander in a given time, place, and set of circumstances to figure that out for themselves. So this is also the answer to the critique that Foch's principles are obsolete, or rather the prescriptive side is obsolete. So for instance, in this book, in Principles of War, he espouses this real confidence that highly motivated infantry can overcome well-prepared defended positions, notwithstanding the firepower of the defenders. That's the prescription. But if you look at it in terms of his intellectual project, that's less important than for the commander to think about, well, does this actually work in given circumstances? Now, Foch made clear, I believe, that none of what he said should be treated as dogma. If circumstances change, then the thing to do is to think about what were the new circumstances, what was going on, de quoi s'agit-il, and then to come up with something different. No doctrine, tactics, or strategy were sacrosanct and above interrogation. He wanted his principles to guide that thinking, that rethinking, but never to be regarded dogmatically or as any kind of orthodoxy. And then, of course, if we look at Foch the commander, he was a general who served in numerous positions throughout World War I, we can see this in action. In his own 2-volume memoir of World War I, plus historical studies of his actions in the war, they make clear that he did not cling to his views about things like the supremacy of infantry-led offensives in the face of overwhelming evidence that just didn't work. His tactics, the tactics that he and his colleagues used in the early months of 1914 didn't work. And Foch was not blind to this. Like, it didn't take him long to see just the reality of it. Like, this doesn't work. We're just getting people killed. So what do? You figure it out and you do something differently. So early in these months, he's already writing to his superiors about how it turned out that, guess what? Firepower really meant much more than he thought it did. And not only that, but artillery was just about everything. The number of guns, the range of the guns, the caliber of the guns, the way the fires were coordinated with the infantry. The infantry could only attack areas where after the artillery had done its job. And so he was willing very quickly to rethink a lot of the positions that he made in the book about things like, infantry overall, right? And these infantry assaults were all that you really needed. Clearly, it didn't work, so let's figure it out. Foch also renounced in those months the idea that was dear to pretty much everybody at the time, and anybody who had read Napoleon or read Clausewitz, and Foch, of course, had read Clausewitz, and he cites him in the book. The idea that the whole purpose of maneuver was to set up and have a big decisive battle, that's how you won wars. Foch, writing in 1914, in the first months of the war, said this idea had to be dropped. There would be no big decisive battle, and we needed to stop trying. Rather, one could reach for limited objectives that would set up the next push for the next limited objective, and then you work methodically and unrelentingly. An idea you could do this at multiple places at once in order to create for the enemy dilemmas about where to send its reserves. And then ideally over time, you exhaust the enemy's reserves. And that's, he thought, that's probably how you're going to win, at least on the Western Front. Arguably, Foch was not able to pull this off until 1918, in part because of his ability as the Supreme Commander to coordinate British and French troop movements in mutual support. He was able to make decisions like who would supply the reserve force for whom and when and where do they go and that kind of thing, to really make fullest use of the available manpower. Also in 1918, the growing presence of the American army began to push the balance of manpower in the Allies' favor. But the idea was already there in 1914. There's also something remarkable about how Foch understood the relationship between the conduct of war and politics and the need to defer to and to manage his relationship with France's civilian leadership. He extended this to the Allied governments in Allied countries. He had to manage his relationships with the British, Belgian, and Italian governments and militaries. This meant also that he had to modify his strategy in light of diplomatic and political requirements. This is something that Royal Castex would later read that impinge upon a strictly military strategy. He spent a lot of time talking to, hanging out with, consulting with, and comforting Britain's civilian and military leadership, as well as Belgium's. And as for Italy, he spent a lot of time basically hand-holding, trying to keep the Italians in the fight and to buck up their confidence as they kept getting battered by the Austro-Hungarians. Now, what about Foch the prescriber? What about his principles of war? Now, they themselves, I'm not going to talk about here. I discussed them in the other video. And by the way, do watch the video. It is one of the very first videos that I made, so I cringe when I watch it because of the production values. Like, I didn't really know how to edit. Also, I've got this really horrible cinder block wall behind me. And besides learning how to edit better, I decided at some point that the wall was just too ugly. The reason why I have all these books stacked up behind me is not to impress anybody, but just because I really want to cover up the cinder blocks. So that's why they're there. Now, okay, there are certain themes, though, besides the principles of war that I want to highlight. Now, the first is the idea of decision. Yes, he thought at the time he wrote his book that big battles were the way to go, but his approach left open the door for alternatives. The point was to think hard about what in fact would achieve decision. The second has to do with the primacy of will, morale, and spirit over material considerations that he never really lost, even though he became much more sober and realistic about things like firepower and artillery, right? It's like still at the end of the day, what you need to win the war are more about the will, the morale, the spirit. He fully acknowledged the realities of modern firepower, but he never abandoned the idea that it's one's will to persevere that's what enables you to win a war. Citing the conservative French philosopher Joseph de Maistre, Foch wrote, "A lost battle is a battle one believes one has lost, for a battle is not materially lost." And as for Foch, the opposite was true. A battle won is a battle in which one does not admit defeat, so it's the will. Relatedly, one had to maintain an offensive spirit at all times. You had to be aggressive. Again, even if that meant being more circumspect. The folly of throwing infantry at prepared defensive positions or the dangers of modern firepower. Often one had to go on the defensive, but always with the idea of returning to the offensive in mind. Every opportunity to seize the initiative and to deny it to one's enemy had to be seized. it might have been necessary, as he acknowledged in 1914, to consecrate considerable energy and resources to the industrial effort, to amassing enormous quantities of things like howitzers. But that, he believed, was not what won wars. It was necessary but not sufficient. What mattered was aggression, will. Perhaps today one might put it in these terms: it is not the size of the dog in the fight that counts, but the fight in the dog that wins. Now, lastly, Foch believed strongly that subordinate officers had to be endowed with active intellects, I think that's how we phrase it, and entrusted to exercise their intellects. They had to be entrusted to figure out for themselves what to do based on their understanding of their superiors' intentions and how it all fit into the big picture. That really was the point of what he was teaching, to equip young officers intellectually to be able to do that. He wanted them to ask, de quoi s'agit-il? What is it about? And then have the intellectual wherewithal to make quickly a good decision and then to act on it. Now, after reading Foch, we're left with a view that one has to think first before acting. Seems pretty basic, but it always bears repeating. But then decide quickly, and then act as aggressively as possible. And in his view, the worst thing one could do was not act. Twice in the book, he says, of all mistakes, one alone is infamous: inaction. Foch died in 1929, and I believe it really was a great tragedy for France that he was not around to play a role in the events of the 1930s and of course, the Battle of France in May and June 1940. Might events have turned out differently if he had still been in charge? I'm inclined to think that they would have. Admiral Raoul Castex wrote this in 1943 about Foch. He said, Foch propagated around him a surprising dynamism. He did not limit himself to resisting in place adverse fortune. He anticipated it to master it, to change its course, to replace it with another, to create events instead of being subject to them. He was, it is the greatest elegy one can give him, the doctor one calls in all cases that are serious, if not hopeless, not only because of his professional value, but also because of his morale, which was inaccessible to discouragement, and his animating mentality. He invested with such a frightening charge, only conceived of his function in the sense of an offensive rebound, toward which he gave all of his force. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Also check out in the description links to my earlier Foch video, as well as to an article I wrote about Foch a few years ago for War on the Rocks. I said before, the video is a little painful for me to watch just because of the production values, but hey, Francis Ecole de Guerre tweeted about it and recommended it, so I'll take that as good of an endorsement for the content as I can get. Plus, also in the description, you'll see links to my Substack, also called Pax Americana, and to my Twitter and my Blue Sky and my LinkedIn accounts and my own website, michaelshirkin.com. Please stay tuned for more videos. There's plenty in the pipeline. Things I'm working on include something about the South African Defense Forces and the Bundeswehr, plus I'm working on something about naval strategy. I look forward to seeing you in my next video, and bye. Thank you.